Finding good horror movies can be hard, doubly so if you're in the mood for a specific vibe. One group that I find particularly rare are those that are able to be scary while still remaining light, easy viewing. These are the kinds of films you might watch while eating dinner, or with some friends and a bucket of popcorn after a day out. Films that don't ask a lot of the viewer, like Session 9 or Jacob's Ladder, and can be enjoyed with no more effort than simply being along for the ride. Number 1. House. House is a movie I can't believe I haven't heard anyone talk about. In fact, I got the idea for this video mainly because I was looking for literally any excuse to bring it up on the channel. I must have been like 5 or younger when I saw it for the first time, and I was terrified. It's probably my earliest memory of watching a movie through my hands, hating every moment, but somehow not wanting to stop. It really goes to show how much our tolerances evolve over time, because watching it now, I'm able to see that it leans far more towards comedy than horror. The premise is about as basic as it gets. Kooky old aunt dies, leaves her creepy old house to her nephew, and when he arrives, horror happens. There's a little more to it than that, but it's mostly just dressing to guide us into the ending. Without the climax it eventually reaches, this whole movie would basically just be stuff happening. And that's kind of why I like it. I've always had the opinion that there's nothing wrong with just showing you stuff, so long as it's entertaining stuff, and the end result is a fun ride. And House is nothing if not a fun ride. You could probably swap the order of a lot of these scenes and it would make very little difference. Many of them seem to have little or no narrative function, but they're just so crazy that I can't look away. You're always excited to see what will happen next, because there's no metric for what can happen. It never allows you to get familiar with any rules or tone that would set your expectations, so no matter how weird it gets, every scene still manages to take you by surprise. It hails from the mystical year of 1985, or 86, search results are kind of confusing on that. And boy does it show. It is just dripping with that delicious 80s cheese, permeating every aspect of its identity. From the hammy characters and comedically gratuitous use of licensed songs, to the practical effects that range from hilariously cheap at some points, to grotesquely terrifying in others. At times, it almost feels like a goofier and more lighthearted take on Evil Dead. It's cheesy, full of baffling choices, and still occasionally manages to be genuinely spooky. It's a really good time, and if you're a fan of 80s horror, I can't recommend it enough. Number 2. Last Shift. Last Shift follows a rookie cop assigned for her first shift to watch over a police station for its final night before closing down. You see what they did? Because her first shift is the station's last shift, but also maybe both her first and last shift? It works on so many levels! I'm not going to tell you that it's a great movie. In fact, in some ways, it hardly feels like a movie at all. More like a series of ideas for spooky things that can happen in a police station. So, why do I like it so much? Well, a lot of them are good ideas, and are executed in ways that maintain just the right amount of subtlety for what they are. Mostly. I love the over-the-shoulder style of the cinematography, and numerous long takes of the protagonist moving from point A to point B. It allows you to build a mental map of the space the film takes place in, making you feel like you're there, and allowing your dread the time it needs to build along with this character, as she carefully makes her way around the building, unsure of which of the endless corners or doorways we should be watching out for. Speaking of the protagonist, I find it hilarious that the streaming description wants to call attention to the fact that she was on The Walking Dead, as a minor character for like 2 episodes. It's pretty funny how they're using that as her claim to fame, when even as a fan of the show, I had to Google who she played. Meanwhile, the movie also has a villain character who I instantly recognized as Savior Jared, who had way more screen time and impact. I know he wasn't on the show until well after this movie came out. It's just funny how much more recognizable he is when the movie is literally trying to market itself on the lead actress's minuscule presence in the very same show. Anyway, this is one of those movies that works largely because it knows the vibe it wants to achieve. And just being along for the ride is a joy all its own. There's a strong focus on atmosphere, and it does a good job of immersing you enough that you'll likely find the downplayed scares to be the most memorable and effective. A surprising amount of time is spent with the main character just sitting at the front desk, anxiously waiting for something to happen. Which might sound lame just hearing it from me, but that's largely the experience of what being alone on the night shift is. And I love how it extends that connection to the viewer. It might make you think back to this movie the next time you find yourself in a similar position. Nightmare fuel to keep you awake. There are several less subtle scenes that aren't nearly as scary as the movie seems to think they are, but in my opinion, the good outweighs the cringe. And at less than 90 minutes, it's definitely worth a watch. Number 3. The Chernobyl Diaries. When I first saw this movie a few years back, I was pleasantly surprised. From vague memories of the commercials that were airing when it came out, I had assumed it to be found footage, and when everyone apparently hated it, I assumed it was another bad found footage film. It follows a group of travelers touring Europe as they spontaneously decide to break from their established plans and visit the Pripyat exclusion zone. They hire a stalker, tour guide, to take them there, but find that the government isn't allowing visitors at the moment. After some protests from his passengers, the guide reveals that he knows another way in, the old security checkpoint, now itself abandoned. What follows from there really impressed me. In a film like this, you generally expect a few minutes of, that was weird, mood building, before something really crazy happens and kicks off the plot. But amazingly, it actually spends the first third of its runtime just walking around exploring. It also uses this period to set up some things that will come into play later, as well as get in a few minor spooks. But for the most part, this sequence really does feel like it comes from a place of genuine interest in the exploration. What makes this work even more is the fact that it's all shot in a very dynamic and immersive way. I mentioned before that, from the trailers, I had assumed it to be a found footage film. It's not, but it does have that handheld look to it, with long takes that move with the actors to make it feel like you're there walking alongside them. Yet, if you haven't figured it out by now, I love it when movies do this. Once it actually gets going, there's a bunch of scenes where they're all huddled in a car. Most films would show a fixed view from the outside or through the windshield to make sure you can see everything. But here, the camera is sitting amongst them, looking all around the cabin and really emphasizing the cramped safety bubble the car represents in the story. I really do feel like this engaging camera work elevates the movie by a whole tier. It is that impactful on the final product. I can certainly understand why some people didn't like this movie. Once it gets going, it's a pretty standard case of go to place, scary thing happens, run to next place, repeat. It's not bad or anything. It just feels like it's missing something to make these scenes more meaningful. It almost feels like they cared more about the exploration aspect, and were just phoning it in when it came time to actually make a horror movie. But if the way I've described the first third sounds interesting to you, I'm sure you'll find something to appreciate here. Number 4. The Autopsy of Jane Doe. I don't have a lot to say about this one, because I can't say a lot without spoiling it. This movie is all about the mystery, and it couldn't have a more perfect premise for that. A brutal crime scene is discovered with one body that stands out from the rest. A young woman found in the basement with no obvious wounds. She's sent to the coroners to determine cause of death, and as they begin their work, baffling discoveries are made, and strange events begin to hinder their efforts. It's a fascinating puzzle to watch them try to solve, as every step of the way reveals new pieces and raises more questions. Every scene holds new discoveries, and the more bizarre it gets, the more you just have to know what's going on. It's very tightly focused, taking place almost entirely in this basement, and establishing a small handful of elements which come into play at various points throughout. This is an excellent use of the setting. I mean, it's a morgue. There's a scene early on where they're opening drawers and introducing the corpses currently residing in them, and it's all obvious setup for scares later on, but it's such horrifying setup that it stays at the back of your mind the entire time. You know it's all going to come up again, and you really don't want it to. There's not much else I can say without spoiling anything, but if you're curious already, I'm sure you'll have a good time with this one. Number 5. Hellhouse LLC. Hellhouse LLC might be my favorite horror film, and it's for sure my favorite found footage film. It takes the form of a documentary about the mystery surrounding the events of the Hell House incident. On Halloween night 2009, the grand opening of Hell House was held, a haunted attraction on the site of the long-abandoned and reputedly haunted Abaddon Hotel. During the first tour, a disaster took place which killed numerous guests and staff members. Officials blame some unspecified equipment failure, but the interviewees aren't satisfied. The only somewhat concrete source of information from that night is some self-shot footage from a patron who was able to escape, showing their tour through the haunted house. All seems normal at first, but as they go, you might catch some hints that something isn't right. When they reach the top of the basement stairs, the crowd at the bottom begins desperately trying to push their way back up, evidently trying to get away from something. What follows is a frenzied rush out of the building, with an uncomfortable realism to its panic and confusion. Neither this video, nor a leaked 911 call, do much of anything to clarify what happened, instead only raising more questions. With nothing more to go on, the story lives on only through whispers and speculation. Until 5 years later, when the documentary crew is contacted by Sarah, a member of the Hell House team, who reveals that they had filmed their time in the hotel in the weeks leading up to opening night. She gives them the footage to sort through, and we see it all from the beginning. This has to be one of the most effective uses of a film working backwards from the ending, as we go through the entire movie not only wondering what will happen, but what did happen. Usually, when this structure is employed, it's meant to keep us looking at events through the lens of how it will all result in a certain outcome. And while that's true here as well, by not telling us exactly what that outcome is, it adds another layer of mystery and makes the whole experience that much more engaging. Is the hotel haunted? Is someone sabotaging the production? Or is it something else altogether? What makes this movie truly special to me is that unlike most horror films, it has a premise which allows it to commit to its subtlety. It never discards its creeping uncertainty for the sake of a scare. While the characters react to events with varying degrees of fear, There's never a moment where any reasonable person would abandon the project and run screaming into the night. In fact, it's so subtle that you probably won't even notice many of the scares on a first watch. Being framed as a documentary, the movie points out many of them after the fact, making several scenes much more terrifying in retrospect. But it doesn't do this for all of them, and finding them for yourself is always a fun surprise. There are some scares, particularly near the end, that I do feel showed just a little too much. I'll often make my own edits of horror films after I've finished watching them, and here, I found that most of my biggest issues could be resolved by just ending a handful of shots a second or two earlier. And that's high praise, considering I just got done chopping like 15 minutes off of dead silence. If you like found footage and suspense, you'll love Hellhouse LLC. As for its sequels, I'll talk about those later.